The wind howled through the canyon that night, but all Boone Cartwright could see was a young woman dying in the snow. What began as a simple act of kindness was about to trap him in something no six-shooter could fight his way out of. The storm had been building since dawn, turning the mountain pass into a frozen hell. Boone pulled his coat tighter as his horse pushed through the deepening drifts. He'd been riding 3 days straight, trying to reach the trading post before the worst of it hit. The cold sliced through his gloves, and every breath came out in sharp white puffs. That's when he saw her huddled against a boulder, motionless. At first, he thought she might be a wild animal seeking shelter, but as he rode closer, the shape became unmistakably human. A young Apache woman, no older than 19, curled in a thin deerskin dress, utterly defenseless against the brutal cold. Her lips were blue. Her body trembled so hard it looked like she might shake herself apart. Boone didn't hesitate. He dismounted in one fluid motion. He'd seen death enough to recognize when it hovered near. The woman's eyes fluttered open. As he approached, dark, intelligent eyes with no trace of fear, only resignation. She was beautiful in a way that made something inside his chest tighten. But beauty didn't matter. Right now, she was dying. He thought about the stories he'd heard in saloons of Apache raids, ambushes, and scalping knives. The old warnings echoed in his mind. Helping the wrong person out here could cost you everything. But as he stood over her, those stories felt like dust on the wind. Boone unwrapped the thick wool blanket from his bedroll, his best possession, the only thing that had kept him warm under the stars. His grandmother had made it years ago before the fever took her. The blue and gray weave had faded, but it still trapped heat like a furnace. Without a word, he wrapped the blanket around the shivering girl's shoulders. She blinked at him, stunned. Maybe kindness from a white man was the last thing she ever expected. Her stiff fingers clutched the blanket like it was life itself. "You'll be all right," he said gently, though he had no idea if she understood. Her breathing steadied, a slow return of color rising in her cheeks. She stared at him with those eyes that seemed to see straight through him, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Boone helped her to her feet and led her behind the rocks to better shelter. He built a small fire, shared what little food he had. She pointed to herself and said, "Ayanna." She ate slowly, her gaze never leaving him. It was as if she was memorizing his face, the lines, the scars, the shadow behind his eyes. They sat in quiet as the storm raged around them. Boone found his thoughts returning to her story. Why had she been out there alone? Where was her family? But those were questions for another time. When morning finally broke, Ayanna stood and carefully folded the blanket. She held it out to him, but Boone shook his head. The storm had passed. He had his coat. She needed the warmth more than he did. Her eyes widened, startled by his refusal. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing to herself, then the blanket, then him, her voice urgent, maybe even frightened. But Boone couldn't understand. He just smiled and mounted his horse. "Keep warm," he said as he rode away. Thinking he'd done a good deed, he didn't look back. Ayanna stood in the morning mist, clutching the blanket to her chest. In her world, what had just happened was not a simple gesture, and by nightfall, her people would come seeking answers that would rewrite the lives of them both. By mid-afternoon, Boone reached the trading post, though his thoughts still clung to the girl like the snow to his boots. Her eyes lingered in his mind the way they'd searched him when he turned down the blanket, like she was trying to warn him. The post stood in a pine-choked valley, smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, warmth hit like a fist. 3 men hunched over a card game. Murphy, the grizzled trader, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Boone Cartwright," he said, setting the weapon aside. "Didn't expect to see you till spring. That storm nearly killed my horses. Had to push through," Boone replied, unbuttoning his coat. "Got business in Santa Fe that can't wait." Murphy poured him a steaming tin cup of coffee, black and bitter. Boone gripped it with frozen hands, soaking in the heat. It made him think of Ayanna again. Was she safe? Had her people found her? "See any trouble on the trail?" one of the card players asked a skinny man with nervous eyes and a long scar across his jaw. "Apache been prowling around," he added. "Folks are spooked." Boone hesitated. The coffee turned to ash in his mouth. He'd thought about mentioning Ayana, but something stopped him. These men wouldn't understand. They'd see a threat where he'd seen a young girl clinging to. Life, nothing I couldn't handle, he said finally. The scarred man leaned back. Smart to keep moving. Last week they hit a wagon train 20 miles south, stripped it clean, left the bodies for the buzzards. He spat into a brass spittoon. Animals, the lot of them. Boone's jaw clenched. Animals, the word echoed, but he remembered Ayana's grateful smile. Not the savagery they spoke of. Whatever her people had done, she wasn't that. She was a woman caught in the snow. Murphy refilled his cup. You can bunk here tonight. Got a room in the back, but I'd be gone at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. When they start drumming, trouble's not far behind. As if on cue, a low, steady beat drifted through the valley. Everyone froze. The card game halted. Eyes turned to the window, but the view was nothing but deepening twilight. There it is again, the scarred man whispered. Been going on for hours. Boone put down his cup, a chill blooming in his chest. The rhythm came from multiple directions, not random, not wild. It had a pattern, like a language, like a signal, maybe a warning, maybe a summons. Murphy reached for his rifle. Maybe they're just passing through, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The drumming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Boone thought again of the blanket, of the way Ayana had looked at him. Had she been trying to tell him something? Something more than thanks. I'll take that room, Boone said, finishing the bitter coffee. But sleep never came. The drums returned closer now, in that relentless beat. Boone could swear he heard his own name. Outside, shadows moved between the trees. Not wild animals, not wind. People, moving with purpose, looking for someone. Boone knew they were looking for him. At dawn, the silence returned to still, to heavy. Even the birds held their breath. Boone dressed quickly and stepped outside. His horse was skittish, sensing what he could not see. Murphy stood nearby, rifle in hand, eyes sunken with exhaustion. They're out there, he said grimly. Watched us all night. I didn't see them, but I felt them. Boone looked toward the trees. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. He saddled his horse slowly, careful not to spook the animal or himself. I'm riding out, he said. If they want something, they'll find me anyway. You're insane, the scarred man snapped. They'll drop you before you make the ridge. But Boone was already in the saddle. Better to meet fate head-on than wait to be hunted. He rode slow, his hands away from his weapons, the mist cloaking the valley like breath from the grave. Then they appeared 7 Apache warriors, emerging from the trees like wraiths. They didn't move forward, didn't raise weapons. They simply blocked the path. Painted horses, silent eyes. Boone's hand drifted to his hip, then stilled. These weren't raiders. This was a ceremony. One stepped forward, older, with beadwork shining on his shirt. He raised a hand. Stop. Boone obeyed, his heart rattling in his chest. The man spoke in Apache, voice heavy with command. The others didn't move. They stared at Boone like he was on trial. Then she appeared. Ayana. Same dress, same eyes. But now his grandmother's blanket was draped over her shoulders like a sacred garment. Her eyes met his, and what he saw made his blood go cold. Not fear, not gratitude. Responsibility. The old man spoke again. This time, Ayana translated. Her English was soft, lyrical, but steady. My grandfather says you have claimed me as your wife. Boone's horse danced beneath him. What? I never. He stammered. The blanket, Ayana said. In our ways, when a man gives his blanket to shield a woman from death, he declares his promise to protect her. Always. It means marriage. The words struck like a blow to the ribs. Boone stared at the blanket. A gift of warmth. Now a binding vow. A marriage contract woven in kindness. That's not what I meant, he said desperately. I was just trying to help. The grandfather's voice rose again. Ayana's voice fell softer now. He says, intentions matter less than actions. You saved my life and claimed me. Now you must honor it. The canyon seemed to close around him. He could feel the gravity of this moment, the eyes of the tribe waiting. One word could change everything. I don't understand your ways, he said. The echo of his voice swallowed by the stone. Where I come from, a blanket is just a kindness. It doesn't mean all this. Ayanna listened. Then her grandfather asked a question. She hesitated before translating, her voice barely a breath. He asks, would you have given that blanket to an Apache man? Boone's throat dried. The truth sat there, waiting. No, he wouldn't have. Probably not, he said, barely audible. The old man nodded, unsurprised. He spoke again, ancient and final. Ayanna's voice trembled slightly as she gave the last translation. He says, you chose to see me as a woman first, Apache second. This shows honor, but honor carries responsibility. Nalnish's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was iron. One of the younger warriors shifted on his horse, his hand casually sliding toward the handle of his weapon. Boone saw the movement and felt a bead of sweat trail down his back despite the icy morning air. These men weren't just here to talk. They were here to enforce their laws, their ways, their customs, whatever the cost. What happens if I refuse? Boone asked, though the answer already clawed at the edges of his gut. Ayanna hesitated before translating. The exchange that followed was rapid, intense. Several warriors joined in, voices hard, overlapping. Boone scanned their faces, trying to decipher meaning in the lines around their mouths, the set of their jaws, the flashes in their eyes. When they finally fell silent, Ayanna's face was pale as snow. If you refuse, she said, her voice brittle, you dishonor not just me, but my family. My grandfather would be obligated to, she struggled, searching for the right words in English, to restore our honor through blood. The threat hung between them like smoke rising from a funeral pyre. Boone looked at each man and turned, and what he saw chilled him more than the storm ever had resolve. These men weren't bluffing. This wasn't a debate. In their world, the lines were clear, and mercy didn't blur them. But then Boone looked at Ayanna, truly looked. She stood tall and proud, her shoulders set with dignity, but behind her calm mask, he saw the flicker of fear she tried to bury. Fear not for herself but for him, for what might happen to her people if this went wrong, for what would be lost in bloodshed. She was caught between two worlds that didn't understand each other, trying to hold them together with nothing but her strength. If you were Boone, what would you do? Would you accept a marriage to save your own life, even if it risked trapping a girl in something neither of you chose? Or would you refuse and ignite a fire that could burn you both to ash? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Boone chose next would shape not just his fate, but the path of every soul gathered in that canyon. There has to be another way. Boone said finally, some test, some trial I can face instead. Nalnish's brows lifted slightly, the first crack in his stoic mask. He murmured something to Ayanna, who looked almost stunned by his words. He says you speak like a warrior, not a coward, she translated, her tone touched with surprise. This is unexpected. She listened to her grandfather again, then turned back. He will consider your words. But first, you must come to our village. You must understand what it is you're truly choosing. A younger warrior, the same one who'd been fingering his weapon earlier, barked something harsh and full of scorn. Nalnish silenced him with a glance, one so sharp it felt like it could cut flesh. My cousin, Ayanna explained. He believes you should be forced to choose now. He thinks you'll try to escape if given time. Boone met the young man's stare, hot, burning, aggressive. This was a man who didn't want compromise. He wanted resolution, and he wanted it in blood. One misstep, one word too sharp, and this canyon would be smeared in violence. I give you my word, Boone said, voice steady, addressing Nalnish directly. I won't run. As Ayanna translated, Boone felt the full weight of what he'd just agreed to. This wasn't a marriage proposal. This was a vow to walk into the heart of a people who had every reason to hate him, a vow to face their customs, their rights, their judgments, all of it blind and unprepared. But as they turned and began riding deeper into the mountains, Boone realized something had shifted. This wasn't about saving his own life anymore. Somehow, without even meaning to, he'd become responsible for saving Ayanna's as well. The Apache village rose from the valley like a vision summoned from the land itself. half-formed mist turning solid before his eyes, hidden between towering red cliffs. It was larger than he'd imagined. Dozens of earth-toned dwellings clustered beside a clear stream. Smoke drifted gently from cooking fires. The sound of laughter, children's laughter, echoed off the rocks. But as the group approached, the laughter died. Faces emerged from doorways and behind trees. Men, women, children, all watching the white man riding at the heart of their warriors. Some looked curious, others openly hostile. Boone felt like a wolf stepping into a fold of sheep, except he wasn't sure who was the predator. Here, Nalnish led them to a wide fire pit in the center of the village, logs arranged in a circle, a ceremonial place. From the largest dwelling, an older woman stepped forward. Her silver hair was braided with turquoise, her eyes black as obsidian, and those eyes locked onto Boone with a coldness that made him want to lower his gaze. "My grandmother," Ayana whispered. "Imala, she is not pleased." Imala began speaking to Nalnish, her voice sharp, cutting, angry. She gestured toward Boone repeatedly, her tone carving through the air like a knife. Villagers began gathering, forming a loose circle round the pit. The hum of voices thickened. "What's she saying?" Boone asked. Ayana looked mortified. "She says, you smell of whiskey and violence. That bringing you here puts the whole village at risk." Her voice dropped further. "She says I've brought shame to our family by accepting gifts from a stranger." The crowd swelled, murmurs turning louder. Boone could pick out words now: arguments, demands, tension. A young man pushed forward, close to Boone's age, maybe younger, eyes burning with something too bright to be just curiosity. He spoke to Ayana with passion, anger, and desperation tangled together. She shook her head again and again, but he pressed. "Who's that?" Boone asked, already guessing from the man's glare. "Kirik," Ayana said softly. "He has asked for my hand many times. He says this is a trick to avoid marrying him." Kirik turned to Boone, stepping close. His hand rested deliberately on a knife at his belt. He spoke in rough English, the words heavily accented but clear. "You take what is not yours. White man, leave now, or I cut out your lying tongue." Gasps rippled through the circle. Boone stood still, every nerve pulled tight like a bowstring. One wrong word, and this village would burn. "I didn't take anything," Boone said, his voice calm as winter wind. "I gave something." "There's a difference." Kirik's face darkened. "You gave nothing. You mock sacred ways for your pleasure, then run back to your people." The tension was razor sharp, but before anything could snap, Imala stepped between them. She spoke quickly to Kirik, words like slaps across his pride. He backed down, but his eyes never left Boone's. Then she turned to Ayana, her voice full of sorrow. Ayana's shoulders sagged when Imala finished. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "She says I must choose," Ayana said quietly. "Prove that your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit I was foolish and accept Kirik's proposal instead." Boone's heart dropped. "The marriage trials?" he asked. "3 tests," Ayana replied. Her voice grew steadier. "Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you fail even one," she didn't need to finish. The alternative lived in the faces surrounding them. Kirik smiled like a man who already saw the ending. Nalnish raised his voice, and the village went still. His tone was final. Ayana translated. "He says the trials begin at sunset, and if you try to leave before they're complete, Kirik has permission to hunt you down." Boone looked around. So many watching, waiting. Some hoped he'd fail. Others hoped he'd prove worthy. But it was Ayana's face that settled his decision. Beneath the fear, behind the sadness, was the same expression she'd worn on that mountainside: strong, proud, worth fighting for. She was worth it, Boone thought, even if I didn't know the reason yet. "Then I guess we'd better get started," he said as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls. The village gathered around the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows against red stone, turning the peaceful valley into a place of ancient power. Boone stood at the edge of the circle, his muscles tight, eyes sharp. This felt like a funeral more than a wedding. Nalnish approached, carrying 3 items: a thick rope, a carved piece of wood etched with sacred symbols, a small leather pouch that clicked with hidden weight. He set them before the fire and began to speak. Ayana stepped beside Boone. "The first trial tests your strength," she said. "You must climb the sacred cliff face using only this rope, reach the eagle's nest. Bring back a feather." Boone turned and looked. The cliff behind the village rose like a wall to the sky, sheer, vertical, no easy handholds, even in fading light. The nest was visible 60 feet up, a black smudge on the ledge. "Men have died trying," Ayana whispered. "Even our warriors sometimes fail." Keurig stepped forward and spoke with mocking bravado. Gesturing at the cliff, laughing, Ayana translated. "He says you will fall like a stone, that your soft hands have only held whiskey bottles." The insult stung. It wasn't entirely false. Boone was strong, but climbing, that wasn't something cowboys practiced. Still, he'd faced worse, or at least, he hoped he had. He stripped off his coat and hat. The cold bit into his skin like teeth. The rope was rough hemp, worn smooth in places. His fingers gripped it. Every villager's eyes were on him. The first 20 feet came easier than he expected. His arms burned, shoulders ached, but years of wrangling cattle and mending fences gave him strength. He'd never measured before. The rope cut into his palms. Blood seeped. Still, he climbed one hand over the other, boots scraping for purchase. Then he slipped. A chunk of stone gave way. His boots kicked air. He swung wildly, the rope jerking taut. The crowd gasped. Someone cried out Ayana. Pain shot through his shoulders, screaming protest. He hung there, spinning gently, staring down at a ring of upturned faces. Keurig smirked, but Ayana's eyes held something else, not fear, not panic, but sheer, desperate asterisk will asterisk. She wasn't climbing, but in her eyes, she was right there with him. Gritting his teeth, Boone found a new hold. His boots scraped, stuck, steadied. He climbed. The eagle's nest waited. A mess of sticks and bones built on a narrow ledge near the sky. Asterisk as his fingers reached toward the nest, a sudden rush of wind and feathers exploded around him. A massive golden eagle burst from the shadows, talons stretched wide, wings slamming, the air with furious power. Boone ducked, nearly losing his grip as the bird shrieked its outrage, its razor-sharp talons slicing across his shoulder and tearing through his shirt, drawing blood. But there, tangled in the thorny branches, shimmered a single perfect feather, golden brown. Kissed by firelight, ignoring the pain searing down his back, Boone lunged and snatched the feather. The descent was a test of will and endurance. Every inch down the rope felt like a mile, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, his breath ragged in his throat. He refused to let go, clinging to the rough hemp like it was his only tie to life. When at last his boots touched the earth, his legs buckled, and he crumpled to his knees. Breathless and shaking, the village murmured with surprise. Even Keurig, who had all but carved his victory in stone, stood speechless, eyes wide with disbelief. Boone raised the feather, its edges glowing amber in the firelight. Nalnish stepped forward, taking it with reverence and examining it closely. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. He spoke, and Ayana, her voice warm with relief, translated. "He says the eagle fought you, but you endured. The first trial is complete." Boone didn't even have time to recover before Nalnish picked up the second object, a carved wooden piece covered in intricate symbols that seemed to flicker and dance in the firelight. As if alive, Ayana's voice tightened again, the tension returning to her shoulders. "The second trial tests your wisdom," she said. "You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns down to embers." Boone looked at the piece, then at the flames. The fire was full now, but in the dry mountain air, it would die quickly. He had maybe an hour, likely less. "What happens if I can't solve it?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Ayana hesitated. "Then you've failed the trials, and failure." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Keurig's expression said enough. He already believed the outcome was certain and deadly. Boone turned the carved stone over in his bloodied hands. The symbols mocked him, ancient and strange. They might as well have been drawn by another species. Round the fire, the villagers whispered, some shaking their heads as if they could already see the end. The carvings were unlike anything he'd seen before. Some resembled animals, a bear, An eagle. What could have been a snake? Others seemed to depict natural elements, mountains, rivers, the sun and moon. But how they connected, what story they told was hidden, locked behind generations of meaning. Boone could barely begin to touch. Can you give me a hint? He asked Ayanna, desperation bleeding into his voice. She shook her head, sorrow in her eyes. The wisdom trial must be completed alone. To help you would dishonor both of us. Kirik called something out from across the fire, his voice smug and confident, even without knowing the words. Boone could hear the gloating in them. Other villagers nodded in agreement. The fire burned lower. Time slipped through his fingers. Then Boone shifted his thinking. Maybe the answer didn't lie in understanding Apache language, but in understanding something deeper, something human. Every culture had cycles, stories, truths that echoed across generations. He stared again at the ancestor stone. There, in the center, was a spiral. Perhaps the cycle of seasons around it. The animals, bear where the sun would be in summer, eagle at spring's position, snake aligned with autumn. He murmured, seasons. It's about the seasons. But it wasn't enough. Other symbols didn't fit. One looked like a person standing in the spiral's heart, with lines radiating outward connecting man to the beasts, the elements, the whole turning wheel. Then the pieces fell together. It wasn't just about seasons. It was about the relationship between man and nature as time passed. The bear stood for summer when strength was used to hunt and store. The eagle symbolized spring, the need to rise, to build, to grow. The snake autumn, when one shed what no longer served, preparing for change. And winter, he'd missed it before, not an animal, but a symbol that looked like a blanket. Shelter, warmth when the world grew cold. And Boone's heart thudded. This wasn't just a riddle. It was a reflection of himself. The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean, he said aloud, his voice carrying across the fire-ringed silence. It's asking why I'm here. He stood, holding the ancestor stone toward Nalnish. Each symbol, Boone continued, is a choice. The bear, the choice to take what you need through force. The eagle to soar above others and ignore their pain. The snake to shed your duties when times grow hard. And the blanket, he looked directly at Ayanna, the choice to give warmth, even when it costs you. The fire had nearly burned down to embers, but before the final glow disappeared, Nalnish raised his hand. Silence fell. He spoke quickly, his voice full of something Boone hadn't heard before, respect. Ayanna's eyes widened as she translated. He says, you understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but knowing yourself. The ancestor stone reveals for paths a man can take. When facing another's suffering, you chose the path of the blanket. A wave of murmurs spread through the villagers. Even Kirik looked shaken. Nalnish wasn't done. He spoke again, and Ayanna's voice trembled. The second trial is complete, but grandfather says the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body, not your mind, but your heart. Nalnish picked up the leather pouch, the one that clinked ominously with movement. When he opened it, Boone saw the contents: small bones, finger bones, carved with more symbols. Ayanna's voice dropped to a whisper, the trial of sacrifice. You must choose what you're willing to lose, to gain what you claim to want. Nalnish cast the bones across the earth. They scattered like fate being thrown to the wind. He studied the patterns in the dirt, eyes narrowed, breathing slow. Round him, the village held its collective breath. Minutes passed like lifetimes. Then he spoke. The bones have chosen the sacrifice. Ayanna translated. Barely audible. You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek. A chill gripped Boone cold. An ancient. What if I don't know what I value most? He asked. Nalnish offered only a grim smile. Then, one by one, he pointed. First, to Boone's horse, still saddled, standing silent at the village edge. Then to the gun belt strapped around his waist. Finally, to the photograph tucked inside his shirt, worn and creased. His parents frozen in time. He says, Ayanna whispered, a man always knows. The bones reveal what you try to hide. Kirik stepped forward, speaking fast, full of challenge and mockery. Others agreed. Ayanna turned to Boone, ashamed. He says this is foolishness, that no white man would give up anything real, not for an Apache woman. He thinks you'll walk away." Boone stared at each item: his horse freedom, the ability to ride away from everything, the gun his safety, his power, and the photo, his past, his roots, the only tangible piece of his family. But as he stood beneath the starlit sky, surrounded by people who had every reason to mistrust him, Boone realized the truth. None of those things mattered as much as they once had. The horse was just a beast, the gun just steel, even the photograph priceless as it was tied to ghosts. But the woman beside him, she was flesh and fire and hope. "I know what I have to sacrifice," Boone said. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the photo. His father, stern; his mother, gentle. For years, that picture had been his anchor. But holding on to the past meant never reaching forward. Boone walked to the fire pit, the embers glowing like old memory. He knelt. "I sacrifice my old life," he said, voice carrying into the dark. "The man I was, the plans I made, the world I thought I knew. I give it up to become the man Ayanna deserves." He laid the photo on the coals. Flames licked the paper. It curled, blackened. His parents' faces vanished into ash and smoke. It felt like a blade to the gut, but he didn't flinch, didn't look away. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Keurig stared, stunned. But Ayanna, her face was soft with wonder. And something else, something deeper, love, born not of fairy tales, but forged through fire and pain. Nalnish stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of tradition and the warmth of newfound respect. He says, "Ayanna translated through tears, you have proven yourself worthy. Not because you completed the trials, but because you understood them. Strength without wisdom is useless. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless." Then Imala, the fierce grandmother who had once called Boone a risk, approached. In her hands was a new shirt, soft deer hide, decorated with beads in sacred patterns. She offered it without malice, only dignity. She says, Ayanna whispered, eyes bright, "Welcome to the family." As Boone pulled the shirt over his head, he felt something inside him shift. The man who'd ridden into the canyon, a cowboy chasing shadows, was gone. In his place stood someone reborn, a man who had chosen connection over comfort, love over fear, purpose over memory. Keurig came to him, no longer sneering. He looked Boone in the eye and gave a small nod. "You fight like Apache," he said simply. She chose well. Around them, the village erupted in quiet celebration. Laughter, music, joy that had been withheld now spilling out like spring floodwaters. Boone took Ayanna's hand in his, the same hand he'd once offered a blanket to beneath falling snow. That blanket still draped her shoulders, but now it meant something more. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a vow, a choice to give warmth to someone else, even if it left you cold. "Do you regret it?" Ayanna asked softly. "Giving up your old life?" Boone looked into her eyes, deep, dark, alive. His past was gone, but in its place stood a future he'd never imagined. "It wasn't the life I planned," he said, pulling her close, "but it's the life I chose. And the only thing I regret is how long it took me to understand what that blanket really meant." The fire glowed low. The stars hung like silent witnesses. Tomorrow would bring new trials, learning the ways of her people, finding his place among them, building something real and lasting from the ashes of fear and doubt. But tonight, with Ayanna's hand in his and his grandmother's blanket wrapped around them both, Boone felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he was home. If you loved this story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more like it to life. Now click the video on the screen for a tale even deeper, with a twist that will change how you see justice forever. What happens when mercy and vengeance collide? You're about to find out.